So we're joined today by Dr. Stephen Baskerville. He is a professor of government at Patrick Henry College, and he is the author of the book Taken into Custody, The War on Fatherhood. That's the title of Taken into Custody, The War on Fatherhood in America. And it's considered to be a classic. It's, what, 10 years now since you published that book? 10, 12?
About 7 years.
7 years ago. And it's considered to be a classic amongst fathers' rights activists and men's rights activists. A very well researched, very well written book about the family court system and the decline of the rights of fathers in the U.S. Dr. Baskerville, thank you for joining us today. Just to kind of focus on your book for now. In your book, you said that one of the biggest pitfalls that we face as far as the decline of the American family is the focus on culture rather than the focus on the government, and that makes us vulnerable to the government. Can you kind of expand on that? If you could explain why that's a problem, put it in your own words. Why is it because people just aren't paying enough attention to what's going on in the family courts and the laws, and do you think that various agencies are using the focus on the culture to distract the American people from the problems of the family court and family law? Do you think, is that how you explain it?
Yeah, I even think it's a major failing of pro-family activists, people who claim to be advocating for the family. I think there's too much emphasis on the culture. Certainly the culture is very destructive and very threatening to the family, there's no doubt about that. But what I think is not adequately emphasized is that it goes far beyond that now. We've passed that point. And the major threat today increasingly to the family is government policy. Now, in some ways, that's well known. It's well known that welfare policy, for example, is detrimental to the family. That it tends to remove fathers from the home. That it tends to break up families. But it's actually far more than that. And the family courts are an excellent example of that. Very few people know how directly family courts are involved in tearing families apart. That's kind of their business. That's the main thing they do. The fatherhood crisis has become a very well-known aspect of the family crisis. The disappearance of fathers, the fact that 25 million or more American children grow up without their fathers is becoming increasingly well known. But there's this kind of idea that fathers just kind of disappear, and nobody tells us why they disappear. The fact they disappear because they're thrown out of their families by family court judges. Right. There's very definite policies and government actions that are taking place here to remove fathers. Sometimes quite good and entirely responsible, perfectly fit fathers who've done nothing legally wrong are routinely evicted from their families and from their homes by family court judges on the simple petition of divorce. And because of no-fault divorce, they don't have to do anything wrong to be evicted from their homes.
Right, and we talk, people blame the fathers. They make the fathers a scapegoat. In these cases, they call them derelict fathers. And you talked about fatherhood campaigns being enacted by various state and sometimes federal government programs. You said that these are oftentimes invite the government into family life, into private life. Can you give us an example of how that happens? Maybe draw an example from your book or anything you can think of right now and how that whole thing works.
Well, during the Clinton administration, the government initiated a series of programs supposedly to promote fatherhood. And under the Bush administration, those were continued, and they were simply called, renamed as pro-marriage. So under conservative governments, it's called marriage, and under liberal governments, it's called fatherhood. But it's essentially the same. It's a form of sort of government-sponsored psychotherapy, which is not really necessary. It's kind of the government creating therapy programs to undo what other branches of the government have done. In other words, family courts destroy families by throwing fathers out of them, and then the government creates fatherhood programs to undo what the family courts have done. If the family courts just stopped throwing fathers out of their home in the first place, there wouldn't be any fatherhood crisis that they would have to correct. So it's kind of disingenuous and rather dishonest, I think, of the government to initiate policies to promote fatherhood when it would be more than adequate if the government just stopped destroying fatherhood.
What do you think is the driving force behind all this, this assault on fatherhood, which is obviously what's going on? What do you
Right.
think is is there? Do you think there's some evil man twisting his mustache some more, saying I'm going to become, the daddy of everybody, and all these dads are just going to be guys who pay child support, or do you think that this is something that's just sort of organically happens with big government, or is it,
Right.
is it a cultural thing? Do you think? What do you think is going on?
A good question. The cliche that many people use, this standard line is follow the money.
Right.
And there's clearly a lot of money being made by this. The legal profession, the social work industry, the welfare system, all of these people have money coming in as a result of this. I don't think that's I don't think that's an adequate explanation. I think, as you say, actually, the growth of government generally, this is another aspect of the growth of government power that's been going on for decades now, the growth of the centralized state. The federal government is up to their neck in this. It's not just state governments by any means. The family courts are underwritten by the federal government. The child support system is underwritten by the federal government. The domestic violence measures and provisions are underwritten by the federal government. So it's increasing government power, centralized power. But I don't think even that is an adequate explanation. I think if you go back far enough, a lot of this is ideological. It's driven by the sexual revolution. I think if I had to find one single cause, I would argue that the sexual revolution provides the ideological subtext for all of this. The feminist movement and the sexual revolution generally of the 1960s and 70s accelerated this enormously. It led to the no-fault divorce revolution, which created the legal framework which allowed this to happen.
Let's discuss VAWA, just kind of off the cuff. This is obviously it was written initially as they say they've changed it, but it was written initially as a sex-specific law, which is based on the premise that only men are perpetrators and only women are victims, and that the problem is so pervasive. If you read the literature about domestic violence that feminists have published, and it is feminists who have basically written VAWA. It was written by feminists. The idea is that men are that men, fathers, husbands, are inherently violent, oftentimes need to be taught not to be violent, and that as such, they shouldn't have basic due process rights. In other words, if you were accused of domestic violence, you don't have the same, unlike any other crime, you don't have the same due process rights, and your presumption of innocence is more or less gone. And the same is true with sexual assault laws, but let's just focus on VAWA. Do you think this is part of the assault on fatherhood? Do you think they work hand in hand, and if they do, how do they, or do you think it's a separate thing?
No, very much so. I mean, VAWA is the best example of what I was just speaking about. Ostensibly, family law is supposed to be handled by the states, and criminal law is supposed to also be handled by the states, not the federal government. But here we have a federal law which provides federal funding, which underwrites and propels much of the domestic violence practice in the states and localities throughout the country. As you say, this is predicated on the assumption that only men create domestic violence. This, in fact, has long been known to be false. Both sexes perpetrate domestic violence in roughly equal measures. But there's even a deeper problem, several deeper problems with this. And that is, few people understand how much of this is driven by family dissolution and by the divorce industry. We have existing laws to deal with violent assault. The whole domestic violence industry is very dishonest because it creates a new category of crime or quasi-crime, which, as you say, it's not just exempt from due process protections. Its very purpose is to evade and circumvent due process protections. In other words, we have laws against criminal assault. If a man violently assaults his wife or vice versa, he can be charged under criminal assault laws, which means he will be charged with evidence, and he will presumably receive due process of law. By reclassifying this as domestic violence and using the term domestic violence rather than violent assault, our governments have created an excuse, a justification, a rationalization for completely evading, circumventing the constitutional due process protections of the law. So, as you say, people can be railroaded into punishments of various kind without any evidence that they've actually committed any crime. If you look at the domestic violence provisions of the federal and state governments, they often don't even require that the so-called violence be violent, or that even any physical contact takes place. I can show you definitions of domestic violence from the U.S. Justice Department, in which it's defined as name-calling, or insults, or verbal abuse. Well, this would, under a violent assault law, this would never hold up in any court, but because they call it domestic violence, there's a lower standard of evidence. Now they're even creating special domestic violence courts, whose express purpose is to punish people for this nebulous semi-crime.
Let's talk about the rise of fatherless children in our country. Now you just mentioned the sexual revolution, no-fault divorce, and that provided the social framework for the legal situation that we're in right now. But there's a lot of people who would say, well, it's not just a sexual revolution; it's a basic inequality in the rights of men and women. I'm sorry, a basic differential in the rights between men and women when it comes to and power over reproduction, when it comes to reproduction and when it comes to children and having control of your children. We have child support, in which a child is taken away from a parent, usually the one that makes the most money. It's usually the dad, and then that parent is given a sum of money, is charged a sum of money, the amount of which they're usually not able to negotiate, and there's no account as how this. The person who receives this money. There's no account as how this is spent. It's almost always the mother that gets this. Women have birth control, they have fertility control. Tremendous, they have godlike powers over their reproductive capabilities, control that men only dream of. Women have reproductive rights. They can opt out of parenthood by having an abortion. If a woman decides that she does not want to become a parent, even after having sex, unprotected sex with a man, becoming pregnant, she can have an abortion. Men certainly do not have this. Right? And of course, men can be forced into parenthood against their will after sex. Now, just as a thought experiment, what do you think would happen if let's say men, like let's say next week, a safe, effective, affordable, reversible, and discreet form of fertility control became available for men, and the Supreme Court, through some freak occurrence, decided that men could opt out of parenthood even after a pregnancy had been started, citing basic fairness, fairness under the law, equal treatment under the law. There are many who would say, as I would say, that if that was the case, then the rate of fatherless children would drop through the floor. That if women had to actually do something to make it worthwhile for a man to become the father of her children, in other words, if they were on equal footing, then maybe we would see families become stronger, and a lot less children running around with no dad around. What do you think about that?
Well, as you say, it is speculative, and these kind of changes in our technology, if you like, often have unintended or unforeseen consequences. So it's very difficult to say. I'm not sure. I certainly don't like to see the answer in terms of not having children. Right. In other words, the solution to this is not for us to have even fewer children. We already have a dearth of children in the Western world, and I don't think we need to lower the birth rate anymore by having men or women opt out of having children. The solution is to have children within married two-parent families, and that's what I see as the solution: is to restore the authority of both fathers and mothers within the family. To me, what basically creates the institution that creates fatherhood is marriage. This is one of my complaints against the pro-marriage movement. There's a lot of talk these days about strengthening marriage, about protecting marriage against same-sex marriage and homosexuality and so forth. But in many ways, the important point about marriage is being lost. What marriage serves to do is to create fatherhood. This is not well known, but it's no accident that we have this rise in fatherless children, at exactly the same time as marriage is becoming weak and divorce is becoming more easy to obtain, and more people are having children out of wedlock. When you have the rights of a father are basically traditionally are created by marriage. A father is the man who is married to the mother of his children. So, to me, strengthening marriage as an institution is the best thing we could do to reinforce the rights and the authority of fathers.
Okay, just one more question along this vein. What if, aside from doing that, if we were to do that, what if we were simply to basically strengthen the rights of fathers, whether or not they were married? You know, let's say shared equal parenting laws,
Right.
accountability for women who receive child support, the removal of the state, the family courts, from the relationship between father and child, and have it the relationship between father and child be defined by the father, the parent of the child. Do you think that would? I mean, do you think that could be also a good solution? That would basically force mothers and fathers to have to see eye to eye on things.
Right.
It would be, in effect, marriage. If two people were to get together, because basically marriage is two people, other than creating fatherhood, is basically a contract between two people if they want to start a family. That's how marriage started in the first place. You know, hey, we want to reproduce. Kids are expensive. They take a lot of care and effort and emotional investment, and it takes anciently and even now, it takes two people to do that. Of course, now you have the government that's become daddy. Do you think that just by that we could, if we simply enforce the rights of fathers as fathers, whether or not they were married, do you think that would solve the problem of fatherlessness as well?
I think if we did those things which you mentioned, those would all be good moves. Okay, reforming child support laws, reforming domestic violence laws, reforming the custody laws above all, to enforce shared parenting. All of those are good measures. They would certainly have the effect that you say they would have. I think they'd all be positive steps in the right direction. I have serious doubts that they're going to happen without fathers themselves taking a certain amount of initiative to demand them. And so far they haven't been very successful at doing that. And so I think that all of those things in some ways are kind of band-aids. I think they're good, but I don't think they're going to happen. I don't think they're sufficient, and I don't think they're going to happen unless fathers take the initiative. And one of the things I think fathers can take the initiative to do is not just to demand their own rights, but to demand the institutions by which, the strengthening of the institutions like marriage, which originally provided those rights. I think, frankly, people may not like to hear this, but I think men that have children out of wedlock are making a serious mistake. No. They're acting against their own best interests. They're, as a Christian, I think they're committing a serious sin. But even from a secular point of view, they're acting against the interest of all fathers. I think men need to take the moral high ground. Fathers need to take the moral high ground to insist that if you're going to have a child, if you're going to have sexual intercourse, you should be married. And to take the moral high ground in restoring the institution of marriage. And I think when fathers start doing that, they're going to be listened to a lot more when they start demanding reforms of other things like the custody laws and the child support laws and the domestic violence laws.
This is going to spark a lot of debate in the men's rights movement because it's really because there's a lot of.
I understand that. Let me just back up. I myself am not without sin in some of these respects. Sure. I was a child of the '60s. I understand all of that. I know we have an entire generation of people that got in the habit of having sex out of wedlock, of even having children out of wedlock, and I don't think those men deserve to be punished. I think those children certainly don't deserve to be punished in that respect. Those children need fathers, and the fathers have a right to their children. So I'm not saying in the short term that fathers who are not married should have no rights. That's not what I'm saying. Sure. I'm saying that fathers, they're going to get those rights more likely and more quickly if they take the moral high ground and stand and cast themselves as the champions of social institutions that have traditionally taken care of children and stabilized society. And when fathers become the champions of marriage, as well as their own rights, they're going to have the moral authority to demand those other things, which are also very valid.
In your book, and I loved how you did this. You quoted Hitler in your book. You said that you quoted Hitler saying, "The state must declare the child to be the most precious treasure of the people, insisted none other than Adolf Hitler, who understood that, quote, as long as government is perceived as working for the benefit of children, the people will happily endure almost any curtailment of their liberty. Do you think that this explains why, I mean, all this is going on clearly, any thinking person who analyzes what's going on knows that this term, the best interest of the children, which is all over our statutes, it falls off the tongues of judges everywhere. Do you think that is what is making people either blind or complacent or scared to speak up about the issue? And do you think that this best interest of the child thing is what hinders fathers' rights groups? It's used as a weapon against people, against fathers who try to assert their rights? Do you think this is the main thing, this idea that the state has convinced us all that they're just acting in the best interest of the children? Do you really think that's the big reason why?
I think it's very important. It's very destructive. Yes, there's more chicanery perpetrated in the name of protecting children than anything else I know of. That phrase, as you say, the best interest of the child, is very dishonest and very misleading. What it does is it usurps, traditionally in every civilized society, parents decide the best interest of their own children, not the state, unless they've done something to forfeit the right to make that determination. It's up to parents to do that. And parents have to be the ones that decide the best interest of their children, not the state. It's not up to the government to decide that. It's people complain that it's not defined. The problem is it can't be defined. There's no way to define it. You can't define the best interest of the child as having the circumstances in which you're acting. That's why parents have to do it. And when the state usurps that power to decide what is the best interest of other people's children, then they are basically breaking down the main barrier to their own power. In other words, the family, the two-parent family, and the prerogative and rights of parents are the main impediment to the unlimited power of the state. And so the state, by usurping that power, is destroying, is neutering the main impediment to its own unlimited power.
Let's talk about recent events regarding, or the buzz surrounding false rape allegations in our colleges and universities. We've been hearing a lot of talk about this in the news. Groups like FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, SAVE, Stop Abusive Violent Environments, and A Voice for Men, and a lot of other groups. The community that are wrongly accused have been writing a lot about this thing, have been publicizing it, have actually gained some traction in our media. People are actually talking about this. And you gave a speech, it was an induction speech, last September, titled Politicizing Potiphar's Wife, in which you addressed the issue of false rape allegations and how the system is set up, and this is specifically in our universities, where sex that is regretted can turn into a false rape allegation, or sex while being intoxicated can easily turn a man into a male student into a rapist who can get kicked out of school, and by extension can ruin his life. And you got a lot of pushback from this. You got, of course, as expected, you expect like the feminists to cause a riot about this thing. But you also got some pushback from an alumni who wrote an article responding to your speech, who was very critical of this. Why do you think? Do you think that there's a concerted effort to quell any kind of discussion or any kind of challenge to the ideologies that drive these policies that take away due process rights for any male student accused of any kind of sexual misconduct? Do you think that now that there is more traction and people like yourself and others are talking about it, that there's an actual let's say a figurative mob being formed to silence people like yourself and A Voice for Men? And
yes, this is one of the striking things about the entire sexual agenda, feminist agenda, is the way that critical voices are very quickly silenced. I'm not the only critic of the false rape allegations that has been attacked in this way. Caroline Kitchens at the American Enterprise Institute did a piece in U.S. News recently. She was viciously attacked for that. Just about anybody who criticizes. In fact, this is a theme of my forthcoming book, is that anyone who criticizes the feminist agenda is very quickly ostracized, oftentimes kicked out of the universities or whatever institutions they're affiliated with. We saw this with the case of Larry Summers at Harvard, but
Right.
it's happened elsewhere with others
Sure.
as well. Yes, this is very disturbing. The universities, they do move very quickly to silence any critic, any dissenting voice, whether it's dealing with divorced fathers, whether it's dealing with domestic violence, whether it's dealing with false rape allegations. We saw this at the Duke University case, faculty members who were acting as judge and jury and prosecutor, taking out ads in the newspapers, declaring these lacrosse players to be guilty, even though they obviously weren't. So this is very troubling. People who criticize the feminist agenda are accused of being apologists for rapists, or apologists for wife beaters, or apologists for pedophiles, and so this is extremely disturbing.
We've at A Voice for Men, we've actually succeeded in cracking the shell, if you will, in regards to being able to talk about this openly, and no one's been able to shut us down. And we're starting to see more and more in the media, columnists, in the news media. There's one woman at CNN, I can't remember her name, who now writes on the CNN website about false allegations and how concerned she is about her son going to school now. So people are talking about this now. What do you think it's going to take for people in academia to be able to speak openly about these things? Because still it's a very, very muzzled environment.
Yes.
In academia. You really, you went through it yourself. What do you think it's going to take? Do you think there's any hope? How do you see that changing, if it is going to change?
Well, it's very disturbing. You're right. It's going to take courage on the part of
Right.
academics.
Of course.
One thing, I've been able to speak out about this because I work at a college that does not accept federal funding. One of the leverage, one of the great means that the federal government has for silencing critics
Title IX funding.
is the Title IX funding. That's right. Those who speak out, those who are charged with rape or sexual harassment, or even those who criticize rape or sexual harassment, can be threatened with punishments. And these punishments are driven by the federal government, and they use the threat of cutting off federal funding. So because I work at Patrick Henry College, I haven't they have no leverage over us through the federal government. So I've been able to speak out more freely than other academics can.
Right.
But of course, we were recently attacked in the New Republic using the same methods because they couldn't get us through the federal funding leverage.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Baskerville, for bringing me in your home and talking with me. I really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for attacking this.